Hello there and welcome to the Week in Parliament. Coming up, after the Prime Minister's big Brexit speech, the Labour leader challenges Theresa May on her EU exit plan.
Can I urge her to stop her threat of a bargain basement Brexit?
I consider the issue, I set out my plan, and I stick to it. It's called leadership. He should try it sometime.
With the Supreme Court due to rule on whether MPs and peers should have a say in triggering our formal exit from the EU, we talked to a Brexiteer and a Remainer about Parliament and Brexit laws. And there's no decision yet on whether to move everyone out of the Palace of Westminster, which needs essential repairs. The chairman of the Treasury Committee tells us why he's decided to investigate the idea.
The big question is whether we need to spend £3.5 to £4 billion, and pretty quickly.
But first, there'd been mutterings in the Commons on Tuesday after Theresa May decided to make her big Brexit speech not in the chamber, but to an outside audience. So, Prime Minister's Questions was the first chance for MPs to grill her directly on her 12-point plan. In her speech, Theresa May made clear that the UK would not stay in the single market, that MPs and peers would get a vote on the final exit deal, and she insisted that no deal was better than a bad deal for Britain. The Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, began with a swipe at the Prime Minister for not setting out her plans in Parliament.
Restoring parliamentary democracy while sidelining Parliament. Mr. Speaker, it's not so much the Iron Lady as the Irony Lady. Yesterday, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister finally provided some detail. Can I urge her to stop her threat of a bargain basement Brexit? A low-pay tax haven on the shores of Europe. It won't necessarily damage the EU, but it would certainly damage this country, businesses, jobs and public service. She demeans herself and her office and our country's standing by making these kind of threats.
What I set out yesterday was a plan for a global Britain, bringing prosperity to this country and jobs to people and spreading economic growth across the country. But actually yesterday we also learned a little more of the Right Honourable Gentleman's thinking on this issue. What he said was the following. She has said that leave the single market, then at the same time says she wants to have access to the single market. I'm not quite sure how that's going to go down in Europe. I think we have to have a deal that ensures we have access to the market. I've got a plan. He doesn't have a clue.
Jeremy Corbyn said Theresa May had talked about the pressure migration put on public services, but tens of thousands of EU citizens worked in them.
Instead of threatening to turn Britain into an offshore tax haven, let's welcome those who contribute to our public services and fund our public services properly so that we do have the fully functioning NHS that we all need and deserve.
Theresa May accepted there were differences between her approach and Jeremy Corbyn's.
I consider the issue, I set out my plan, and I stick to it. It's called leadership. He should try it sometime.
The SNP leader at Westminster, Angus Robertson, said Theresa May's plans for leaving the European Union would lead to job losses in Scotland.
The forecast for people's income is it is likely to drop by £2,000 and that 80,000, Mr. Speaker, that 80,000 people may lose their jobs in Scotland as a result of the hard Tory Brexit plan of the Prime Minister. Does the Prime Minister believe that this is a price worth paying for her little Britain Brexit?
Yeah.
The right honourable gentleman once again talks about the possibility of a negative impact on Scotland if Scotland were not part of the single market. His party is dedicated to taking Scotland out of the single market by taking it out of the United Kingdom.
It was quite clear from the Prime Minister's speech yesterday that she seeks to build a Brexit consensus and to bring our country back together, and I thank her for that. To that end, and indeed to strengthen the Prime Minister's negotiating hand, before Article 50 is triggered, would she please consider at least publishing all those 12 objectives in a white paper so that we can debate them here in this place on behalf of all our constituents?
Well, my honourable friend is right. I absolutely understand the point that she raised about Parliament's desire to be able to debate those objectives, which I set out very clearly in the plan that I set out yesterday. One of the objectives, one of the principles I set, was about certainty and clarity, and it continues to be the government's intention that we will provide clarity whenever it is possible, and we will ensure that at appropriate times both the public and Parliament are kept informed and are able to consider and properly scrutinise these issues.
Theresa May and Anna Soubry on Parliament and Brexit. And the role of MPs and peers will be in the spotlight over the next few days. The Supreme Court is due to rule on Tuesday on whether or not the government will have to put a bill through Parliament, triggering Article 50, beginning the formal start of the Brexit process. While in the spring, ministers are due to put forward the Great Repeal Bill, incorporating EU laws into UK legislation. In both cases, there have already been suggestions that peers, particularly the pro-EU Lib Dems, could seek to put down amendments, making the whole complicated process that bit more tricky. So, to discuss what MPs and peers could and should be doing, I spoke to Conservative MP Sir Cash and Lib Dem former MEP Sarah, now Lady Ludford. I began by asking her if peers were going to cause trouble for the government.
I wouldn't call it trouble if the Lords does its proper job of scrutinising legislation, because after all, take back control meant anything, it meant parliamentary sovereignty. And
but
it is
people
sovereignty
have
of the people,
voted for Brexit, and this is triggering Brexit. So how can you object?
Well, I think it is perfectly within the purview of the Lords to scrutinise very carefully what the government's plans and negotiating objectives are, and the Prime Minister spelled out 12 points, and to put those through the normal kind of scrutiny. If it's a bill, it's legislation, then we have every right to pin the government down on what exactly its plans are.
So, Bill Cash, any Article 50 bill, let's call it that, will have to go through the Commons too. What do you think will happen there?
Well, the indications are quite clear, which is that the Commons will put it through. There's no doubt about that. We've had lots of indications from the Labour Party and from other members of Parliament on the other side of the House. So I think it will go through the House of Commons. As to the House of Lords, I think it's, as you indicated at the beginning, pretty incongruous and I would say pretty disgraceful to suggest that when you have a sovereign act of Parliament, which was decided on the referendum itself, an act of Parliament passed by 6-1 in the House of Commons and passed by the House of Lords, to have a referendum on the simple question, do you want to remain in or leave, and then to start quibbling about the manner in which that would be done, subject only to the question of whether the Supreme Court actually makes a decision, which in itself is not, because we've already had a vote on Article 50, is not going to alter the voting in the House of Commons, which is the elected chamber.
Let's assume that the Article 50 bill goes through. The next thing that we will probably get would be the Great Repeal Act, as it's been called, which is due to come up in the Queen's speech. Now, there's already concerns that the Lords might try to block parts of this too, because this will be the piece of legislation that puts all the EU laws into our laws so that they can be amended.
The Lords has traditionally objected to what are known as Henry VIII clauses, whereby the government abrogates to itself a great deal of the decision-making of the detail. I mean, it's going to be the most enormous exercise, But again, the Lords will be subjecting it to close analysis and not just writing blank cheques to the government.
Bill Cash, doesn't Sarah Ludford have a basic point here? The government is going to have to change an awful lot of rules and regulations, which is going to be done by ministers in statutory legislation or secondary legislation. Isn't that giving the government an awful lot of power? Isn't she right that the Lords should scrutinise it?
Well, I drafted the repeal bill during May, actually, because I had a feeling that we were going to get the right result. And I drafted it based on 5 principles, which were that we would withdraw, we would repeal the European Communities Act, we would transpose the legislation now in Europe into UK Westminster jurisdiction, so that it would be UK law, and that we would effectively deal with the treaties at the same time. Now, the bottom line is that that will be redrafted, I'm sure, by Parliamentary Council. So the question of the scope of the bill is something which it also applies to the Article 50 bill. And I think it will be drafted pretty tightly because the principle has been established by the outcome of the referendum, which is terribly simple, which is, do you want to remain in or do you want to leave?
Sarah Ludford, you've obviously got reservations. You've obviously got things about this you want to change. But many people watching would say, look, the majority of the British public voted for Brexit, and with the best one in the world, nobody voted for you.
Well, that's absolutely right, which is why we're very conscious of the conventions and the constraints on the role of the Lords. And of course, the main constitutional role is for the House of Commons, which is why we're saying the ultimate sovereignty lies with the people. They must decide whether they accept the outcome of these negotiations or whether they want to choose to remain in the EU.
Well, the answer is implicit in what Sarah's just said. The answer lies in the decision of the referendum. Do you want to remain in or to leave? That was the sovereign decision of the people. That's what we stick to. It was the direction, as the Remainers themselves have accepted, let alone respected, that this is the outcome, and that has to be implemented. It will be implemented, and it's been agreed that there will be a final vote in the House of Commons and in the House of Lords on the outcome of the treaty. And the bottom line is that, therefore, the discussions that take place, which she's asking for, will take place, but at the same time, the outcome of that will be put to a vote in Parliament, and so you get both. You get the sovereign decision of the people in the referendum, which has taken place, and you get a vote of Parliament at the end. I don't think any reasonable democratic person could argue otherwise. But then, if I may say with respect, Sarah, as you were just asked, you're not exactly in the best position. You've got 110 appointed peers in the House of Lords following your line.
Well, your party's got many more. They've got over double that.
Yes,
so,
well, that's probably
and
why,
keep appointing many more, which is the problem. But the really democratic,
Lady Ludford, you have to
is
let
the will
Bill
of
Cash
the
finish
people.
it.
Yes.
The will of the people is what's democracy.
Yes, and the will of the people, as expressed in the referendum itself, demonstrates, point 1, and point 2, that referendum itself, a sovereign act, was passed by 6-1 of the House of Commons, who are elected. That is the bottom line, and I don't think it's up to the House of Lords, or indeed for that small part of the unelected body which represents the Liberal Democrats, to stand in the way of the will of the British people.
No,
all right, we're going to have to leave it there.
Standing in the way of the will of the people if they deny a referendum on the final Brexit deal. That's the truth.
We could obviously talk about this for a lot longer. Sadly, we're out of time. So, Lady Ludford and Sir Bill Cash, thank you both very much indeed for coming into the programme.
Thank you.
Now let's take a look at some more news from around Westminster in brief. A bill which aims to speed up house building in England with neighbourhood plans received a mixed welcome in the House of Lords. Many peers like the idea of consultation with local people about how best to develop their area, but others warned of a top-down system. The minister said home ownership was becoming harder.
Millions of young people are living with their parents until well into their 30s or struggling to save for a deposit while they rent. Too many can't afford a roof over their head at all. This isn't just an economic headache, it's a profound social failure, my lords.
I have noticed that in spite of the general consensus about the urgent need for new homes, there is always a tendency within every group, every locality, even MPs in their debates, to say yes, but we must make an exception for this valley, this village, or this reason, etc. I do hope that we don't have an outbreak of yes, buts amongst your lordships. And I hope that every amendment will be looked at in terms of will this reduce or increase the number of homes available to the young of today.
The Northern Ireland Secretary James Brokenshire says he hopes campaigning for Assembly elections does not exacerbate tension and division. Northern Ireland is going to the polls on March the 2nd following the collapse of the executive in Belfast. The Deputy First Minister, Martin McGuinness, resigned in protest at the handling of a renewable energy scheme. His decision meant the First Minister, the Democratic Unionist Arlene Foster, was also out of a job, bringing the Northern Ireland executive to a halt.
This election is about the future of Northern Ireland and its political institutions. Not just the Assembly, but all of the arrangements that have been put in place to reflect relationships through these islands. That is why it will be vital for the campaign to be conducted respectfully and in ways that do not simply exacerbate tensions and division.
Around 8 million tonnes of food is wasted each year in the UK. The Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Committee is investigating and heard from the big supermarkets. A Conservative questioned their policy on selling misshapen fruit and veg.
I just wonder why you call these vegetables wonky or misshapen or less than perfect. They are perfect, they're just a different shape. And I think you're contributing, well, I wonder if you are contributing to the problem by referring to them as some kind of, weird byproduct. Wouldn't it be better simply to sell them as they are? Because that's what they are. Perfectly good, nutritionally. Why don't do that? Why don't you do that?
I think it helps customers to work out what they're buying in store. So by designating in a particular way, it's clear. So, for example, if you were to buy onions, for example, from our wonky range, they may be more dirty. They may have more dirt on them. The sizes may be different. And if a customer isn't aware that they're buying something slightly different to what they ordinarily might buy, typically then they'll come back and say, well, is this the same product? And start to question, if you like, what we're selling them. So one of the things we're trying to do actually for customers is to be clear about what it is they're buying and then provide the choice.
MPs have been told that staffing is the biggest problem facing maternity services in England. The Health Committee heard that enough midwives are being trained, but they're not necessarily being employed. The committee's hearing followed a report from the National Childbirth Trust, which blamed a shortage of midwives for women feeling like they've been treated like cattle.
The number has been quoted about 2,500, 2,600 of a gap. Is that a figure that you would support?
Well,
that you
our
recognise?
current figure is that we're 3,500 full-time midwives short.
So you feel it's actually worse?
Yes. There are various issues. One is that we are seeing a rapidly increasing number of midwives retiring from the service. So the number of midwives now aged over 50 is very significant. So there's a need to replace as midwives leave, and the number going out is now pretty much equating to the number coming in. So you're getting flat lining of the workforce.
As Donald Trump prepared to take over as US president, a Conservative peer lambasted his predecessor, Barack Obama, as the most useless American president in my lifetime. Lord Blencathra was taking part in a debate on the rise of populism around the world. He made clear he'd be pleased to see the end of the Obama era.
Tomorrow, my lords, we will be rid of the most useless American president I have ever seen in my entire lifetime, whose only legacy is rhetoric. He has withdrawn America from the world stage and left a disastrous vacuum that's been filled by Putin and China. He withdrew troops prematurely from Iraq and allowed ISIL to flourish. He laid down red lines on Syria, on the use of gas in Syria, but did nothing to enforce them when they were breached. He turned a blind eye to Russian hacking for 7 years and 9 months, but suddenly became concerned about when Hillary lost the election. But never mind, he has his place in history. The next time I visit the United States, I'll be able to use the transgender toilets.
His worldview was challenged by a former Liberal Democrat leader who argued it was time for politicians to abandon their tribes to counter populism.
Spare a thought for a moment for the lost tribes of Labour and the Tory party. I mean, what do you do these days if you are part of that great Tory tradition of internationalism and now find yourself in a party that has completely abandoned it? What do you do if you're one of those Labour members of Parliament who believes in the free market not as our master but as our servant, and finds your party has explicitly rejected it. It's extraordinary in the last year how much politics has spun away to the extremes. This is the time for us to get out of our tribes and start working together to ensure that we can help build that central consensus, that centrist consensus, that moderate, liberal consensus, in which I believe the only chance lies for altering the very dangerous trajectory of our country.
Back in the Commons, an MP raised concerns about human rights abuses in Myanmar, also known as Burma. Thousands of Rohingya Muslims are said to have fled to neighbouring Bangladesh amid allegations that the Burmese army has carried out human rights abuses. Troops took control of the region after armed men raided police posts, killing 9 officers in October.
It's very difficult to get accurate information for what is happening in Rakhine State. So in order to get to the truth beyond false reports, will he call for full access to independent observers and journalists to villages and displacement camps in Rakhine State?
He asked about UK support for an international commission, I assume a UN-type commission. Can I just say that a UN-led commission of inquiry can be established in one of 3 ways, by either the UN Secretary-General, by the UN Security Council, or by the Human Rights Council. Establishing an inquiry in this way would require broad international support, which we assess does not exist in the current international environment.
The Minister rather sidestepped the question of action in the UN by saying that the government's opinion was there wasn't a sufficient consensus at the present time to take forward action. Will the government commit to trying to build that consensus as opposed to really remarking that it doesn't exist?
Will the Minister make very clear to the Burmese authorities that their welcome re-entry into the international community will not be helped if they fail to protect minorities, and particularly the Rohingya community?
Hundreds are being attacked. Many are being murdered. Their villages are being systematically burnt or destroyed. Many are being sold into slavery with the complicity of Burmese authorities, the very authorities of which treat the Rohingya as a non-people. Now, my honourable friend, the Minister, has avoided the challenge from the Right Honourable Member for Gordon and my honourable friend, the Member for Gillingham, that it is not sufficient for the government to cooperate. The government needs to lead UN support if these reports are true.
Since the Burmese security forces started their campaign in October, it's been estimated that around 65,000 Rohingya Muslims have fled the country. According to reports, the minority group have been subject to arson, rape and murder at the hands of the military. Such allegations are incredibly serious, and it's for that reason I asked the Minister, for the 4th time I believe, if he will continue to call for the establishment of an independent investigation into these claims.
The Minister said there were a number of avenues the government could pursue, and that included continued work with the UN. Now, what's been happening in the wider world of politics this week? With our countdown, here's Simon Vaughan.
A good week for Brexit Secretary David Davis. He's revealed he made £1,000 betting on the results of the EU referendum. No wonder he's looking cheerful. Government and opposition whips were on a works night out on Wednesday. They swapped their house for This House, a play set in the whip's office during the 1970s, and posed for photos with the cast. The House of Lords says it's planning to reupholster the arms of the Chair of State in the robing room in the next financial year. Big speeches on Brexit this week from Theresa May, and she's also found time recently to pose for US Vogue. And finally, sport. The Speaker interrupted Scottish questions on Wednesday to update MPs on the tennis.
At this Scottish Office Questions, I'm pleased to inform the House that I've just been notified Andy Murray has won his 2nd round match in Melbourne. David T.C. Davis.
Simon Vaughan. Now, it's one of the most iconic buildings in the world, but the Palace of Westminster is in need of urgent repairs. It's not clear yet whether MPs and peers might have to move out while the work takes place. A vote on that is expected in the next few weeks. But the estimated repair bill is substantial. The Treasury Select Committee is investigating whether that's value for money. Its chairman, Andrew Tyree, told us more.
The Palace of Westminster is in a poor state of repair, and certainly a lot of money is going to have to be spent to sort it out. The big question is whether we need to spend £3.5 to £4 billion, and pretty quickly. So both how long it takes and the amount need to be carefully examined. The public will want to be confident that everybody has looked at this and made sure all of this spending really needs to be undertaken and undertaken now. And that's what the Treasury Committee will look at. In doing so, it will look at the report produced by Deloitte, on the basis of which the Joint Committee of both houses came to its conclusions.
Andrew Tyree. And that's it from me for now, but do